Alright, let's talk about some of the best assault weapons in Fortnite Save the World. Now, the educated among you might already be aware that I've covered this weapon once before on my channel. In fact, I covered all of the best weapons in the entire game, and that is hands down one of the most popular series on my channel, and I'm a little disappointed that I haven't remade these videos sooner because some changes have taken place that have made those videos a little outdated, including my old top 10 video. I actually remade this entire video listing everything that I covered, and I definitely recommend watching that before watching this because it definitely gives a nice intro to the series that I'm creating here. Now, if you've already watched those videos, then you definitely already have a good idea of some of the best weapons in the game, and honestly, nothing that really changed made those videos completely obsolete. In fact, the most notable changes is that many things actually got stronger. So, lots of you are probably going to expect this, but of course I'm going to be talking about the weapon changes spreadsheet. Thanks to Dyson for noting all of these, we're going to be focusing on the assault weapons today. Meaning, if you look at this spreadsheet, at the worst of it, everything just sort of stayed the same amount of damage, but at the best of it, a lot of these weapons actually got a little bit stronger. Now, that's not going to fundamentally change most of what I'm going to say. Like in the first video, I noted pretty early on, based on the order that I talked about these, the Beat Blaster and the Blackout are very, very similar weapons, and the Beat Blaster getting a small 8% damage buff isn't exactly going to be rocking the world or anything, so I will be talking about a lot of what I mentioned in the previous video, but on top of all of these changes, I am older, I am wiser, I have learned lots more about this game, and I will be providing more and more insights into some of the weapons that we'll be discussing. Not to mention, there are weapons like the Lectro shock rifle and the floor flusher, which straight up didn't exist when I recorded the first video. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, the spy weapons didn't exist. In that first video, the Blitzer had just come out that previous week, so some new things have definitely happened. And, not to mention, new fancy 6 perks exist. Now, obviously, the floor flusher and the Grunt introduced some new 6 perks with the extra elemental bonus damage and the fact that you can stand in place to grant extra damage, and nowadays, you can go to any of these weapons and use core reperks to change these. It should also be noted I did an entire video on how to spend core reperk, which actually acted as a really good guide to some of the serious changes and what weapons got impacted by this new 6 perk change, and pretty much everything is in here. So if you're curious as to what changed, even if you're not looking to spend your core reperk, I actually recommend watching this video. It'll be linked below, of course. I will mention those 6 perks where notable. If I don't bring up those 6 perks, or if some of your favorite assault weapons aren't mentioned in this video, just know that I skipped them probably for a reason. If I don't bring up a weapon in this video, it was probably not significant enough to mention, but I will open this up to future changes, meaning I will state, just for the record, any changes will be updated in the pinned comment down below. Always scroll down there if you're watching this video in the future just to make sure that everything is up to date. And there are 2 changes that I want to note. You might have noticed in the previous list of changes, the Nailer and the Ranger are both noted of getting really decent damage bonuses, 22 and 23% respectively. I have not actually looked at these weapons since making my previous video. The Nailer is actually kind of a joke. My entire best perks on it is an 8-second video of me recycling the schematic, and the Ranger has never been tested by me before. So I am going to leave those 2 weapons as a question mark on today's video, and if I do end up covering those in the future, once again, check out that pinned comment, and when they are covered, they will be linked in the description below, along with all of the best perks for all of the weapons that I've covered here today. So there are going to be a lot of links in the description below, but I highly recommend checking them out because today's video will not be focusing on the best perks for these weapons necessarily. Those best perks videos individually will talk way more in depth about these individual weapons. Today, we're just going to be doing a light overview of some of the best assault weapons in the game. So without further ado, let's talk about the Lectro shock rifle, because of course I do have this one supercharged. Now, of course, we will just be going down this list alphabetically. I don't think there's any other way to do it, so let's start with the weapon that I have supercharged and why I have supercharged it. So the Lectro shock rifle was a starter pack weapon that is essentially a reskin of the Argon assault rifle. So we're effectively going to be talking about both of these weapons up front. The Argon assault rifle is a painfully mediocre weapon, and that's still true with the Electro shock rifle. However, the Argon assault rifle has a little bit of an audio cue where it sounds like it's shooting twice as fast as it really is, and there's a lot of like muzzle flare where it makes a flash every time you shoot, and I don't know what it is, but they definitely changed the feel of the Electro shock rifle where it shoots slower, more focused beams, and I can definitely see where I'm shooting. And even comparing it next to the Argon assault rifle, I can see that the Argon assault rifle is also as accurate, but it just never felt as good. So in my brain, I felt the Electro shock rifle was worth supercharging, and if you're interested in supercharging your own weapons, I'll link my video on that down below. It definitely is a good talk into which weapons are worth it, because there are weapons like the Nocturno, which, ironically here, I actually don't recommend supercharging, and that's because this weapon is already just insanely powerful. And yes, this is a transition. I don't have much else to add about the electroshock rifle. It's a fun weapon that I personally really enjoy. I highly recommend using it and the Argon assault rifle if you're interested in trying those weapons at all, but they aren't really a top tier weapon. They're more of like a B plus A tier weapon. The Nocturno is what we call an S tier weapon in the industry. So when you're ranking weapons in this game, A, B, C, D, just like a US report card with the way that we do grades, the Nocturno is what people call like an S tier, meaning it is like the gold standard of an amazing weapon. It is also coincidentally the exact same base damage as a Siegebreaker. This isn't going to show very well because I've supercharged my Nocturno, but they do have the exact same damage, crit chance, everything, except for the fact that the Nocturno has one more crit damage perk option down here and a completely different 6 perk. So I will be showing gameplay of the Nocturno here where it is just exploding crowds of enemies and it is incredibly effective. That's actually why I don't recommend supercharging it, but I just wanted to make the best weapon even better and I don't regret it at all. Now, even though they have the exact same damage output, the Nocturno and the Siegebreaker, the 6 perk on the Nocturno adds 65% of the bonus damage every time you reload or finish eliminating that enemy, affecting other enemies around it. So if you are reloading absolutely perfectly, like against a smasher, it's very easy to do so, or a mini boss nonetheless, you are essentially adding 65% of your damage on top of the weapon and to the surrounding enemies. Now, that doesn't work out perfectly. You have to be really, really precise to make that actually, viable. You're always going to reload with like a little bit less than 65% HP remaining on the enemy that you're shooting, but it is just a phenomenal weapon all around. And the Storm King's Scourge is a very, very similar story. It is very, very strong. If you switch off between targets and you're shooting between two at a single time, you are essentially doubling the damage because when you switch enemies, it'll deal 100% bonus damage. Or if you just build up to 5 charges, which essentially works out to about a 20% damage bonus, it's a really, really accurate weapon. It was essentially designed to be the best AR in the game. That's kind of the idea of it being a mythic weapon, and it definitely does not disappoint in that regard. I don't think I needed to tell anybody that the Storm King AR is a definitely good choice. Now, the Beat Blaster and the Blackout are two weapons that I mentioned briefly in my previous video. I'm just going to make it quick and say they both shoot 2 shots at a time. They both perform very similarly, and the Blackout is a weapon that now has a fancy new 6 perk. So if you end up using this with the extra damage against nature enemies, it can be really, really effective. Unfortunately, the Beat Blaster was not so lucky. None of these 6 perks are new or game-changing in any way, so I do nowadays consider the Blackout AR to be a slightly bit better than the Beat Blaster, considering it'll do a lot of extra damage against nature enemies, but fundamentally these weapons are very similar, and there's nothing really new to add. The Blitzer is an interesting one as well, because this is one of those older, wiser things where, back in the day, like I said, this weapon had just been out for a week, and I didn't really know what I know now, but thanks to Dyson, who made that previous spreadsheet, the Blitzer, apparently, he actually did the math, if you just take the base damage of the weapon and you factor in the time spent reloading between shooting, if you're just constantly firing at an enemy, the Blitzer is, technically speaking, I cannot stress this enough, this is not real world performance, it is not the best AR in my opinion, but mathematically speaking, it has the highest base damage when you factor in reload speed, which is interesting because it has a really, really quick reload and a decent-ish fire rate, but a pretty good base damage. So it's kind of all around a decent, really good weapon, but it does shoot projectiles. These snowballs are a little bit hard to deal with, and you will very, very often be missing shots. However, the 6 perks are very interesting. You can do that 44% damage against fire enemies, which makes it very good against fire enemies. And then, of course, you can freeze enemies in place. It makes it for a very interesting weapon that is definitely worth trying out if you've never used it before. The Bundlebuss, once again, there is nothing new that I can say in this video that you guys haven't heard before. Needless to say, it is just a powerhouse of a weapon, and instead of covering it in today's video, wasting our time, I'm just going to link my videos on it down below. I have covered the Bundlebuss best perks, best uses for the Bundlebuss, and hell, I'm even going to link my Storm King video because the Bundlebuss comes up in there as well. There is no point in taking precious seconds away from what's already going to be a fairly long video talking about a weapon that we all know is phenomenal. The Corn LMG is once again another example of me learning things since recording. I stand by the fact that this weapon is heavily hindered by the fact that it's locked to physical. This weapon is not going to perform very well against elemental enemies in the late game. However, there are ways to get around that, meaning you can run triple crit damage on this, and while I don't really love it when you need Totally Rockin' Out to make a weapon good, if you are a Totally Rockin' Out fanboy, there are very few weapons in the game that are a better candidate than the Corn LMG. Throw on like a reload perk here and then triple crit damage, put on Totally Rockin' Out, and just have a fun time. You're going to be a glass cannon, but it is definitely an interesting way way to play, and I don't recommend changing the 6 perk. You can get more damage and you can get more crit rating by making these 6 perks different, but I do believe those candy droplets dropping on the ground, giving you some extra healing while you're in the fight, is kind of more essential than those. However, there are definitely options to make this weapon better if you choose to do so. The Deathray is a weapon that, as you can see by my perks, is not something I'm going to be spending too much on in today's video. It's essentially like, in my opinion, it seems like a worse Argon assault rifle. Even though the DPS is a little bit higher, the Argon, it performs a little differently, but the Deathray might be stronger. This could be a little opinion based, but my point is, it is just, if you're going to be using energy cells, I'll just say that you should probably just use the Storm King's AR, and that's kind of it. The Deathray has its own video. I'll link it below, of course, as mentioned, but I'm kind of going to be skipping over it because it's not going to be helping you too much. The Dragon's Roar is interesting because as of recording this, actually, Lunar Llamas are what's available. Now, this won't be true in the future, but it's basically a piercing AR that can affect lots of enemies at once, and it was really interesting back in the day because it had Affliction, which most weapons, didn't have. It was kind of a new thing, and you can have those Roman candles, so it's a very fun weapon, very interesting, but it has a bit of a quirky fire rate. For a semi-auto weapon, it's a little annoying to use in my personal opinion, but you can definitely have a fun time with it. So if you find yourself playing a nature mission, maybe you might want to try out the Dragon's Roar, but I don't know. The Drumroll is a fantastic example of changes that have made this video worth recording. So I appreciate you tuning in for the updated video because the Founder's Drumroll has definitely gotten a bonus. Now, back in the day, it had a 6 perk that gave it headshot eliminations, cause an explosion. In fact, now that I'm recording this, I believe I saved the very last Drumroll that I ever crafted because it had that old 6 perk, which isn't really good for anything. The new 6 perk is better in every way, but when you have a weapon that's now legacy, it's just kind of fun to save it. In the Drumroll's case, every 10th round increasing your damage by 15% is really nice. 40 rounds in, you can get a 60% damage bonus, and that is really, really good. So, of course, I have a mag size perk on this because it has, 87 rounds. Not to mention, I use Assault Ammo Recovery, which essentially adds 31% rounds back on top of that. So, I'm essentially shooting for over 100 bullets before I have to reload, which means a huge amount of my bullets are getting buffed by that 6 perk. So, whenever you hear a loud bursty sound whenever you're shooting this weapon, I don't know if I'm going to be able to get good gameplay for that, your weapon is just getting 15% stronger, 15%, 10 rounds later, 15%, 10 rounds later, and it just gets better and better. And the Drumroll is, if you are not well informed, basically a reskin sort of the Bobcat of all things. So for those of you who don't know, Founder's weapons are generally reskins. As you saw earlier, the Nocturno is a reskin of the Siegebreaker, and the Drumroll is basically a Bobcat. I don't have any of these that have the exact same perk, so it's not going to show as well, but you can just kind of infer here that the damage is very, very similar. They both have a base 50 mag size. They have a very, very similar reload speed, and they're not exactly the same, but they are very, very close to each other, and that is definitely a good place to compare the Drumroll to. Just know that it is it's a unique weapon, and it's definitely gotten better. The Gammatron 9000 is an AR that is essentially unchanged since my last video. In fact, I'm going to chain together a few of these. The Gammatron, the Gravedigger, and the Mercury LMG are all, just stronger than they used to be, basically, or unchanged at all, and they're all just good weapons in general that are definitely worth using. The Gravedigger is an old favorite. I know we all love to see it, but it is unfortunately not something that has fared well in the world of power creep. All of the weapons around it have gotten stronger while it got a measly 3% damage buff and has been mostly kicked to the curb. Unfortunately, I love this weapon. It's one of my near and dear favorite weapons of all time, but it is just not exactly a powerhouse. It's, as I mentioned earlier, with the other weapon, it's basically about a B or a B plus weapon. It's not really going to be ranking too high. The HackSAW, however, is not a B+. It's more of like an A or S tier weapon. A lot of people have kind of argued with me because they tried it in-game and didn't really experience what I was saying. This is more of a mathematically good weapon. On paper, it is really strong, but in practice, you need to run fire rate damage because there is no crit rating perk. You can't run a crit build on this weapon, which definitely holds it back. Fire rate and damage is mathematically identical to crit rating crit damage. However, in practice, it means you're just going to be draining your magazine, shooting more bullets to do the exact same amount of damage that a crit build would have done anyway. So a lot of people in game are shooting tons and tons of bullets and killing enemies how they feel to be slowly, even though it's actually quite fast. So it's a weapon that you kind of need to know what you're getting into to have fun with, but it is definitely a strong weapon. The Hammercrush is once again, I gave the disclaimer earlier that the Nailer and the Ranger were out of my scope, but the Hammercrush is a weapon that I am definitely interested to take a look at some point because it is not a weapon that I've really tried much. I leveled this up because I was using it on my Twitch stream, link to that in the description below, and it was definitely good. It actually one-shots a lot more effectively than I thought, but I have not dealt with this weapon significantly, enough to really give you a good perspective on it. I don't think this is a top-tier weapon. If it was, it would have shined, and I would have known that immediately, but it's definitely something that's worth having fun with, so, we'll leave that one open to interpretation later on. Hydra and the Rat King are two weapons I'm going to cover at the same time, because there is, I don't actually think I have a Rat King leveled up. Oh my goodness, I don't even see it. Yeah, after looking through my inventory, it seems like the Rat King, I must be either blind or it's in my collection book, but the Hydra and the Rat King are two weapons that shoot shotgun shells as an AR. They are slow-firing, high-damage weapons, and they perform very similarly. Both of them I've used just double crit damage and reload. You've run first shot Rio in the lead, and you can just crit on every single hit, and there is that new fancy 6 perk where 5 hits in a row can cause a small explosion around a target, which, with a Hydra, shooting what I believe to be, whatever it says here, a tight cluster of pellets, can basically trigger that explosion on almost every single shot, which is really, really cool and can make an old weapon even more interesting. But it does definitely require first shot Rio for that 100% crit chance. Otherwise, it's just a very, very substandard weapon. Just like the Lynx. This is a weapon that I tried in a recent video and it underperformed. It's just a burst weapon that exists. It's outclassed by the Gammatron and the Razorblade, and it's just kind of not my most recommended weapon. As for the Pain Train, this is a weapon I should have mentioned earlier with the Mercury LMG and the Gravedigger and the Gammatron, where it is essentially unchanged. It is just as strong as it always used to be. That stacking damage and crit rating can both be very, very effective, and it just is a weapon that gets stronger the longer you shoot it, assuming you're not shooting it longer than 15 bullets, because that's as strong as it's going to get. It can definitely buff its own damage, and it makes it a very, very, very powerful pick. It's right about in line with the Siegebreaker in performance once you get down to it. So, yeah, if you haven't used the Pain Train, I highly recommend it. I did just casually mention the Razorblade is good, which is a weapon I've harped on in the past, but I can't ignore it. After using it recently, it is really quite good. The math is hard to work out because that fire rate is tricky. This is a burst weapon, so I don't know if Epic is factoring in the time between bursts. I don't know if that fire rate is just how fast the bullets are shooting for the 3-round burst that you get. I'm not actually 100% certain how to calculate this weapon. However, in game, it performed better than I could have expected. I'm not going to pretend like this is a top tier weapon. It's not going to be blowing my hair back, anything crazy, but it is definitely quite good. Now, the Swan is a weapon, we're skipping over the Siegebreaker, mentioned that earlier, is a weapon that is kind of, I don't know, I'll just call it a B tier. I'm not going to waste too much of this video on it. It is a weapon that has some interesting 6 perks, each shot upping the fire rate, damage, or crit rating, depending on what you got, and it can be fun to use, but I've never been convinced that it's a top pick weapon. The Terminator is basically the HackSAW, but it can run a crit build, and even that doesn't save it. Its DPS is strictly lower. It is an inferior weapon to the HackSAW every single time I've ever done the math, other than the fact that you do have a crit build on it, which is nice. You won't have to waste as many bullets, but it unfortunately does not save the weapon. The Floor Flusher is definitely a last but definitely not least weapon. It's not literally the last here, but it is extraordinarily strong. In my updated top 10 video, I actually ranked this weapon tied with the number 2 slot. Now, the number 2 slot on that video was sort of an asterisk section where it wasn't literally top 2 weapons. It was basically weapons that in certain circumstances can be amazing, meaning the Floor Flusher against a normal non-elemental enemy is doing about as much damage as the Siegebreaker. It's relatively unimpressive and it's nothing really to write home about, but my goodness, when you factor in that 44% damage against, the elemental enemy that it should be shooting at, in this case against a water enemy, it is literally over 300,000 DPS. Now, I've strayed away from numbers in this video a lot. We do use a calculator and I am very well informed when I talk about this, but in this case, I will say this weapon goes from about a 220,000 DPS to over 300,000, which, if you want a frame of reference, the Nocturno is one of the only other weapons in this entire list that can actually break that 300,000 barrier, and weapons like the Siegebreaker are hovering around about a 217,000 DPS. So 300,000 is monumental, and if you've ever used the Floor Flusher with the correct element and the correct 6 perk against the correct elemental enemy, meaning nature, water against a water enemy, it is an absolute monster. I, of course, have 3 of these just to cover all of the different elements because this weapon is so strong. The Grunt is a weapon that is definitely new to this series because I did not cover it in my previous Best ARs video, but it is kind of, it's a fun weapon. It's not my personal taste. It's kind of a DMR kind of thing where you're shooting 8 bullets. It's a semi-auto weapon, and it performs well enough. It's kind of an okay defender weapon if you want to use an assault weapon defender, but I thought that I would love this weapon a lot more. In my opinion, it is exactly a fun weapon sometimes, and mathematically, it does do really good damage. So if you're okay with a DMR style weapon, it's basically a single shot version of the Bundlebuss, but with the Bundlebuss shooting 8 rounds in a burst makes it pack quite a punch. So the Grunt is kind of an inferior version in my opinion, but it's just not really my playstyle, so your mileage may vary. The Tiger is a weapon that I'm just going to be brief with. I'm running a crippled on this for some reason. This is just the last time I use this weapon, but it is a very accurate, fully auto weapon that performs surprisingly good. I don't have much to say about it as it's not really a top threat weapon. It's not a, it's not top on the charts or anything, but it is a weapon that I made a video on recently, and I'll let that video speak for itself because it's an interesting weapon to say the least. The Wraith is a weapon that I mentioned at the very beginning of my last assault weapons video, and that's because it's sort of a controversial pick. In my opinion, it is not worth the hype. In a lot of people's opinions, they've, put it in their own videos and ranked it #1 AR, and it's just not. The DPS is very similar to the Siegebreaker. I believe it's slightly more. I'm not 100% certain on that. But the problem I have with this weapon is the inaccuracy, meaning you essentially have to be standing still in order to get a consistent spray out of this weapon. After about 10 shots or any amount of movement, it is spraying all over the place, and I don't really agree with people suggesting that you should shoot slowly to make this weapon better, because the slower you shoot, the less damage you're outputting, and it just makes it a very clunky experience in my opinion. However, lots of people really like that crit chance, and the fact that it can have such a high crit chance means it can two-shot many enemies very efficiently, and it can even one-shot many enemies depending on your crit or headshot accuracy. So it can perform very well, but when you're going up to the true test against a Smasher or a mini-boss, you definitely have better options. So I am not saying the Wraith is a bad weapon. This is definitely, it's even a weapon that made my top 10 list. It's just not the #1 weapon that a lot of people think it is. Now we are down into the weapons that I don't have 130, which is typically a bad sign. So we're going to make this a little quick. The Duet is a very dramatic weapon on my channel. I have loved and hated this weapon at different times in my life, and to this day, I am uncertain. It is a weapon that it made me so disappointed that I collection booked it day 1 of its release, but in previous uses, I found that bullet shrapnel can make it pretty good in crowds of enemies, depending on how you use it. I went way more in depth in its own video, link below of course, and I'm just going to leave it there. The Duet is definitely a weapon worth using if you're at all interested. It looks insanely cool, but I've never been convinced that it's anything too insane. Now, the Hunter Killer and the Buzzcut, I'm not sure why I don't seem to have a copy of the Buzzcut around here, but it might be in my collection book. They are the same weapon, as the Buzzcut is a scavenger version of the Hunter Killer. Again, it's just a semi-auto weapon that is rather unimpressive. I'll let its video down below speak for itself. And coming close to the end here, we have only got about 3 more. The Steam Piston is, again, just a semi-auto weapon that performs well enough. It's a steampunk AR, and it's very cool in its design, but it actually performed really well. I will say that. It's not a weapon that shoots fast enough to really satisfy my playstyle, but it impacted really well, and it definitely one-taps a lot of normal enemies, but it behaves very similarly to the Wraith, except that it shoots a lot slower. With the last 2 on my list, I'm going to actually do the vacuum tube rifle before the end here, because the vacuum tube rifle is a weapon that should have been mentioned a lot sooner, because this is a weapon I don't currently have 130 in my inventory, but it is a very good weapon, because it is a prime example of those 6 perk changes, which we've mentioned several times today. But one of the 6 perks you can get is eliminating an enemy chains lightning, and that is super lovely. For a weapon that is already a semi-auto, you're not really going to be spraying it into a crowd of enemies killing tons of things, but with that chain lightning, you are just passively eliminating 6 extra enemies at a time per elimination, which makes it really nice to use and is a very strong pick. Definitely a strong weapon that I wish I had leveled up. And the Vindertech Pulsar is essentially just a underwhelming AR. I'm not going to be mentioning it too much. It's just a burst energy weapon that is not exactly going to be anything to write home about. So there it is, the best ARs in Fortnite Save the World. These videos take a ton of work, and I do intend to finish the rest of this series should this video be well received. So if you guys want to see anything else, comment down below. I want you guys to comment and thumb up any video you want me to cover regarding the best pistols, snipers, SMGs, shotguns, whatever you guys want next. Thumb up those comments and let me know what to cover, because I definitely love to do more of these. If you guys want to support the channel, feel free to use code Mista to check out. I definitely test tons of my weapons on stream, so link to my Twitch in the description below. If you guys want to subscribe, I'd really appreciate it. Become a channel member here. You guys can use those emotes down in the comments. Thank you guys so much for watching, and have a nice day. And then